Welcome to EduFaith Essentials, everyone. EduFaith Essentials is a podcast, an educational podcast that provides information and tips about education, leadership, and topics relating to diverse learners. I am your host, Dr. Nakia. Thank you for joining me. I'm sending you guys good vibes, and thank you for just being a part of my webcast as I try and promote the message of equity and inclusion. EduFaith Essentials' mission is to bring positive awareness and promote equity and inclusion by sharing information about topics related to non-traditional learners. The goal is to restore faith in education one student at a time by empowering listeners with knowledge. We all know that knowledge is power, so let's be powerful. So I want to always start with a little EduFaith inspiration. So I scream, you scream, we all scream for inclusion. So as a former cheerleader, this topic is dear to my heart. I was a high school cheerleader. And so the EduFaith inspiration message is about cheering for inclusion. It's the season for sports. It's football, baseball, basketball. All the sports are in season here. And so the message I want to share is about a couple of inclusive cheerleading squads. So there are actually three of them, and all the ones I'm talking about are out of Metro Atlanta, Georgia. So the first two I want to bring awareness to is they're out of Cobb County School District. There are two high schools, Harrison High School and Hillgrove High School, and they have inclusive cheerleading squads where they feature students with special needs at the high school level, boys and girls, and they bring school spirit to the sports. I firsthand witnessed these two squads, and they were adorable. They were sweet, and it just brought cheer to my heart. So kudos to Cobb County School District and their inclusive cheerleading squads as they share the magic of inclusion and school spirit for all students and all learners. So kudos to Cobb County for that. On the other side of Metro Atlanta, I want to bring awareness to a squad called Special Twist. And Special Twist is a co-ed squad that's open to all special needs participants from ages 4 and up with no requirements. Special Twist was founded in 2014 by Stacy and Rachel Van Dyke. Rachel is Stacy's daughter, who was 15 at the time when she developed Special Twist as a community service project. They often cheer at Lambert High School in Suwanee, Georgia, with the squad during football and basketball season. If you are interested in starting an inclusive cheerleading squad in your community, this is the best resource for you to look at, usasf.net. And under the website, you can look up special needs cheerleading squads, and or you can just Google special needs cheerleading squads in your particular city and state. And if you're interested in finding out more information about Special Twist, feel free to check out this link right here. And if you're interested in seeing the story about the Cobb County School District Squad, this is a link. If you copy this link and push this link in, it'll give you the full story about the inclusive cheerleading squad and why the Start Squad was created. Both squads were created to foster inclusion, and both coaches, all coaches wanted all students to be a part of something special. So I think that's a great story, and that is our EduFaith inspiration for today. So when we look at some essential news, some of the news comes from the fall, October, September 2022, but I wanted to bring a little awareness of news and what's going on in the world of special needs, special education, and IDEA requirements. So government offices released documents back in October that fosters collaboration between state and local education agencies with Head Start programs to effectively meet the needs of students who are being considered under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act requirements. The U.S. Department of Education and the Office of Head Start and U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office of Head Start authored a Dear Colleague letter and guidance documents. And these documents affirm that state and local education agencies and Head Start programs have responsibilities for implementing IDEA to ensure that children with disabilities enrolled in Head Start programs receive that free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. So if you want to find out more about Head Start programs and how they're merging and trying to make sure that students with special needs get those services early, check out those letters. There were two of the letters right there. The Dear Colleague letter on IDEA services and Head Start, and then the guidance on creating an effective memorandum and understanding high quality support for inclusive early childhood education systems. So check those stories out. Also on Essential News, I wanted to point out some news back in September in the U.S. Department of Education. They're examining how they can advance equity in programs and how the 2023 determinations processes can promote equity for the 2023 school year. They're considering ways from using data from current school practices when making determinations in a manner that accurately represents IDEA implementation for those historically marginalized populations. They will use this data along with community input and identify ways to prioritize equity within the IDEA requirements. So the U.S. Department of Education is always working behind the scenes and trying to find ways. So those two stories on Head Start and just promoting equity for those populations are on display. You can check that out at the U.S. Department of Education website, as well as those Dear Colleague letters. So let's go ahead and jump into essential knowledge. And so today, what we're going to talk about is this is going to be one of maybe a 3 or 4 part series because special education is such a large topic. But we're going to be talking about the overview of special education. And I just want to define special education. Special education is a set of services provided to students who experience unique learning needs. These services are governed by federal law, and that federal law is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Special education is defined as specially designed instruction at no cost to parents to meet the unique needs of a child with a disability. So when we look at the law, where does the law come from? I talk about this a lot in my books and my essential tips for parents, my essential tips for special education leaders. I always start chapter 2 out talking about the law. So just to give you a little background about the law, this all came from Public Law 94-142 and Public Law 94-142, which is now IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, states that disabled children and adults ages 3 through 21 are educated in the least restrictive environment with their non-disabled peers. Under Public Law 94-142, an appropriate education may comprise of education in regular classes, education in regular classes with the use of aids and services, and special education and related services and separate classrooms for all or some portions of the school day. So just making sure a child with the disability get all their services, whether they're in a regular education class, full-time, part-time, some of the day, or if they're in other classes where they're getting that direct instruction. And I'll explain those different classes in a later podcast, probably part 2. I actually focus on that. So PL 94-142, it actually originated the Individual Education Plan. And that is a document that it documents the child's individual needs and provides that special instruction to meet a child's needs in school. Special education, I want to point out, special education is not a placement. So students, we get that connotation that, oh, they're placed in special education. No, students are not placed in special education. Special education is a service that's offered to students from schools and districts. The IEP addresses learning goals and objectives, present levels, the educational performance, specific content, and related services. Special education services are usually initiated through some type of RTI or multi-tier or intervention team at the school level. And then based on that data, the team determines if that child may need more specific or specialized services. And those services are initiated through those intervention teams. And through those intervention teams, they may determine that they're going to conduct an evaluation to determine if that child needs that specialized instruction. In order to start the services, a parent must provide consent to begin those services. So when we're looking at special education and you say, what is an evaluation? Well, an evaluation determines a couple of things. It determines whether a child has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits learning. It talks about the possible causes in the evaluation, maybe why that child may have that deficit or that disability. Also, the strengths and the weaknesses of the child's physical, emotional, social, vocational, and intellectual areas. The educational diagnosis category that best describes the child's disability, which usually states have a list of categories that a child may get services or receive services under, the special services, the instructional techniques, how those services are going to be provided, and other interventions that the child may need, the appropriate instructional placement for the child, reasonable predictions of the child's academic, social, and vocational potential, the evaluation outcome based on those components, and all that information is encompassed together in a vast, large size report. And teams usually sit down and go over that data and determine if that child meets criteria for special education services. So once all that data is gathered, the team will meet, and the parent will be a part of the team members. And most of these services, like I said, they begin through some type of intervention team or through some type of interdisciplinary team approach. The interdisciplinary team can be, like I said, it can be a RTI team, the multi-tier system of support team, intervention team. A lot of times they call them child study teams, student support teams. So those type of teams are the teams that sit together with the parents to talk through the need for services, talk through the evaluation, and then once the evaluation is complete, the law requires that the teams sit together with the families and talk about the documentation. During this meeting, the team uses the data to individualize the student's needs, and using those assessments, they go through and determine if that child qualifies for services under one of the state-aligned special education categories. And if they do require services, then either during that meeting or a meeting in the near future, the team will determine the development of an individual education plan. The IEP addresses learning goals, objectives, present levels. A lot of that present level information comes from the actual evaluation, educational performance, specific academic and related services, the extent to which the child will participate with non-disabled peers, the date of starting services, the date of ending services, and other appropriate measures of how the goals are going to be measured and progress is going to be documented. So when we're looking at the overview of special education, I want to note for my parents, you are active team members. You do have rights, and usually those rights are offered at every meeting, regardless if it's the first meeting or the annual meeting. And you must provide consent to begin the evaluation, and then you must also provide that consent to begin those services after the evaluation is complete. Special education falls under specific state categories. Every category is different throughout the state, but here are some categories for which a child may receive special education services: speech, other health impaired, developmental delay, autism, emotional behavior disorder, deaf or hard of hearing, specific learning disabilities, language impairments, orthopedic impairments, mild or moderate intellectual disability, severe and profound intellectual disability, and traumatic brain injury. Once a child is eligible, the team meets annually every year to update the IEP. And then the team also meets every 3 years to evaluate that child again to determine what services are needed and what updates need to happen at the every 3 year mark. Sometimes teams collect additional data and do additional assessment or evaluation measures, but every year the IEP is updated, and every 3 years there is something that we call a reevaluation to look at services and determine the continuation of services and how those services are working for that child, along with the annual. So when looking at special education, I know that it can be daunting and intimidating, and it's such a large subject and it's such an unknown subject. But I want parents to know that you're not alone and that schools and districts and schools will help you through the process. And if you have questions or whatever, please feel free to ask questions. There are services, even if the child does not qualify for special education, there are other services that students can get to help support disabilities or even interventions in place. Most schools have intervention teams that work. Make sure as a parent you familiarize yourself with the district procedures and processes and just ask questions about different information, including your parent rights if you're looking at special education services for your child, or if you're even looking at other services for your child. There are services in place. And I talk about all this in my book, which is Essential Tips for Parents of Students with Disabilities. Grab a copy. So my tips for parents, I'm going to give a few tips for parents, educators, and just my viewers and listeners If you see that a child is struggling academically, behaviorally, they have any learning or social deficits, reach out to the teacher, school personnel about some interventions, an evaluation, or what other supports. So special education might not always be the answer, but like I said, schools have different supports that they can support students, whether it's services for special education or serve other services for students with disabilities. Schools have services in place to educate all learners, and I want to use this platform to share that information. Of course, today we're talking about special education, but I want you to know that if your child is struggling, families, there are services in place. So reach out to the school. So, my essential tips for parents: seek those services and build a partnership with the school that supports your child's special needs. Don't be afraid to ask questions about special education services. You have a voice, use your voice, and be actively involved in your child's education. Like I said, make decisions, have a voice, come to the table, come to the team meetings, even if you physically can't be there, Zoom into the meetings, do a phone conference, but be actively involved and make sure that you understand what's going on with your child, because you are your child's first teacher. And parenting is a lifelong journey. For my educators, I want you guys to be actively involved in all of your students' education. And I say this as a leader and a former educator, or current educator. Attend those meetings, provide that valuable feedback. Educators, you are the content expert. So you know about the grade level standards, you know about the curriculum, you know what the general or regular education setting looks like. So when you come to those meetings, bring that expertise to the meeting so you can talk about the child's progress compared to non-disabled peers. You can talk about the curriculum, talk about the standards. I want educators to focus on being a collaborative team members and don't look at this as another chore. So be collaborative, provide the information, provide your expertise. Your voice, educators, is very valuable, whether you're a gen ed teacher or a special education teacher. We need you guys to be involved in those meetings. And then for my leaders, I just want you to make sure that you're supporting your students, your parents, your teachers, and all of your school, and you having that inclusive culture. I do want to read some of this quote, and it says, administrators who clearly understand the needs of students with disabilities and instructional challenges work with the educators to work with students with disabilities. And so leaders who understand this importance, you don't have to be 100% expert, but if you understand the importance of students with disabilities and that inclusion and that culture, then you can provide as a leader those well-designed learning environments and facilitate the development of appropriate student placements and specialist assignments that accurately represents those students' needs. So leaders, you are needed, even if you have some type of general knowledge and that you're supporting all parties involved. And we're looking at special education and diverse learners. So now it's time for my books excerpt, and I have a couple of books, and I just wanted to point out the main book I read from today. I have Essential Tips for Parents of Students with Disabilities, but I also have Essential Tips for Special Education Leaders for my leaders. And then I have Essentials of the IEP 101, which provides a lot of information. The Essentials of the IEP 101 is less than 50 pages. It's an easy read. The Essential Tips for Parents, that book is where I got a lot of my information from today. And I read clearly from chapters 3, which talks specifically about the IEP. And so what I want to do with my excerpt today is just read a little bit about my personal journey. My son received services, and I'm going to read for you pages 43. My son received services through an IEP for deficits associated with language impairment, autism spectrum disorder, and other health impairments for attention deficit disorder. His services were provided in a small group setting and in the general education class. When he was first diagnosed, he struggled in the general education class. He would get frustrated and cry a lot, and his general education teacher did not know how to work with him when he was frustrated. A lot of times she would actually send him to the special education teacher's classroom for him to complete his work. And that teacher was a wonderful teacher. Her name is Mrs. V, I'm going to call her. Mrs. V was awesome to Alex, and she had the patience to bring out the best in Alex and equip him with skills to work through his frustrations. When Mrs. V taught Alex, she even taught Alex to tie his shoes. That's how effective she was and just how patient she was. His dad and I found it difficult to teach him to tie his shoes because he has some visual spatial deficits. And as parents, we just didn't understand that at the time. So she taught him how to tie his shoes. I love Alex being in Mrs. V's class. However, as much as I love the safety in her class, I know he needed to be educated in the least restrictive environment. The data demonstrated and documented that Alex had the skill set to be in a general education classroom with his same age peers. However, a lot of times he spent a lot of time because of his frustration in the class with Mrs. V, who was a special education teacher. Over time, we had a lot of struggles with this general education teacher, and we ended up having Alex change to a different classroom. His new teacher was Mrs. B. I know Mrs. B, Mrs. V. Well, Mrs. B was awesome. She worked with Mrs. V and she mirrored the strategies from Mrs. V's class and supported him in the general education class. They worked out a schedule where Alex went to Mrs. V to take tests and where he had extended time and accommodations. But still, for the most part, he received a lot of his education in a general education setting where I knew he needed to be. Working with Mrs. V and Mrs. B taught me, and I was able to mirror those supports at home for Alex to be successful. So that's just a little excerpt of from my story, and that was pages 43 and 44. And it's just a lot of backstory of why I had his teachers changed. I'm not recommending any parent to have the teacher change. Educators have the best at heart when trying to make those decisions. But just with what was going on with him and him spending so much time in special ed, I felt like that teacher was not equipped to work with him. And so we had to have a conversation and a couple of meetings, and we determined that Mrs. B was actually better equipped in the classroom, and she might have had a co-taught classroom, which was better, whereas he was in a general education class singularly with the other teacher. I'm not quite, it's a long story, but for the most part, I'm not recommending parents change your child's teacher, but I am saying out of this, sometimes some teachers are better equipped to deal with students with special needs. And once he made that shift, he flourished with both teachers, and the other teacher was more open to work with the special education teacher, and Alex flourished. I'm just going to leave it at that. I have read for you chapter 3 of Essential Tips for Special Education Leaders. And so I just want to share a little bit of my story because I come to you as a parent, as a leader, and as an educator, and I do understand. All right, if this is now the time for essential advice. So if you want any advice from me, I have 27 years in education and I do know a little something. So if you have any questions, you want any advice, if you're a fellow educator, if you're a parent, family member, community member, please, I want to use this platform to provide resources and information to you. So feel free to email me at edufaithforall@gmail.com. All right, edufaithforall@gmail.com. So my quote for today, until you have a kid with special needs, you have no idea of the depth of your strength, tenacity, and resourcefulness. And that's anonymous. That author, or whoever wrote that, thank you. You have no idea. As a parent, the strength, the tenacity, the resourcefulness all came out as a parent, also came out as an educator, because we need to do what's best for our kids and make sure our students have the best, regardless of their background or their learning ability. If you need any assistance with any college or career readiness, also help support college accommodation advocacy, so I can help with that. Professional development for your business, for companies, I present it to companies. One-on-one coaching for educators, if you're a special education educator or a gen ed educator or just a leader, you want some one-on-one coaching, I can work with you. Any diverse learner program development, parenting classes, and just a plethora of services. I feel like I'm an inclusion expert because I have that twofold from being a teacher and a parent. So please reach out to me at EduFaith Consulting at www.edufaithconsulting.com. I would love to hear from you. So this is going to lead to the end. I encourage everyone to get essential. To my believers, be blessed, and to all others, be kind, be well, and be the change. Thank you for watching this webcast. And if you're interested, the podcast is also available. It's on all podcast platforms. And make sure that you like and follow me at EduFaith Essentials. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful day.